Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the fourth webinar in our European Green Week series. Tonight, we're returning to the topic of biodiversity with a focus on invasive species, particularly non-native invasive species, which are considered to be one of the biggest threats to biodiversity worldwide. Our presenter tonight is Dr. Frances Giaquinto, an ecologist. And Frances is also the lead on the giant hogweed control program on the River Loobagh. So with that, I'll hand you over to Frances.
Thank you. So good evening, everybody. Thank you all for joining this webinar on everyday invasives, hosted by Limerick City and County Council under the European Leaf Award. Without further ado, we'll get started, and I hope you all find it informative and useful. Thank you all for participating. I'm going to cover 4 topics this evening: what the problem is with invasive species and how they impact us, and then I'll go on to talk a little bit about the different types, those that are controlled by legislation, those that aren't. Then I'll spend a few minutes talking about the giant hogweed project, our new vision for invasive species control, and finally a little bit about how you can help to stop their spread. And if any of you think that invasive species aren't really a problem in Ireland, this picture might change your minds. This actually isn't from Ireland, but these 2 species, American skunk cabbage and giant butterbur, are on their way. This is my only slide with text, so please bear with me while I go through it. I just want to clarify some of the terms I'm going to use this evening. So first of all, invasive species. Well, an invasive species is any organism, plant, animal, microorganism, fungus, insect that spreads rapidly or aggressively. They tend to become the bullies in the world. They march into a site, they dominate, they colonize very quickly, they outcompete everything that exists there already, and in the worst cases, they kill everything off around them and may make the land may render the land completely unusable. Native species, well, there's a much tighter definition than I'm going to use this evening, but for the purposes of this talk, a native species is an organism that's existed in Ireland for thousands of years, and they form part of our natural environment. Non-native species, on the other hand, are just simply species that come from another country or place. And then somewhere in between we have the naturalized species. These are non-native, they come from another country or place originally, but they've been here for so long that they just become part of the kind of fabric of the environment. And then there's invasive alien species, the acronym IAS, and these are the ones that are aggressive, they're non-native, they're aggressive, and they go on to cause substantial harm to the economy and environment. And these are the ones that we're most worried about. So first of all, I just want to spend a few moments talking about why invasive species are a problem. The main reason, the underlying reason, is that they harm our ecosystem services. This is a term coined by the economists, and it means all the benefits that we freely gain from nature. Our food, whether it's meat, fish, eggs, cereals, crops, vegetables, fruit, it all comes from nature. Our warmth, our firewood, our oil, our gas, it all comes from the environment. The oxygen cycle, we breathe in oxygen and we breathe out carbon dioxide as a waste product, and then the plants around us, they breathe in our waste product, the carbon dioxide, and they breathe out oxygen. And without plants, we would have no oxygen and we wouldn't survive. The carbon cycle is the same. This is the process of regeneration and decomposition. If we didn't have all those millions of microorganisms breaking down our organic matter, we'd be surrounded by dead bodies, we'd be buried miles under leaf litter, and we wouldn't survive as a species. And water. Our water on the planet is a finite resource, and all those microorganisms are continuously cleaning it for us, enabling us to survive and to live with the water available. So ecosystem services, these are the sort of the bedrock of our human existence. Now, our ecosystem services, they come from biodiversity. That's what nature is. And biodiversity, it's a term that was coined in 1992 at the Earth Summit in Brazil, which was where leaders from all around the world came to talk about, for the first time, the protection of the world's natural resources. And biodiversity means three things, really. It means all the species on the planet, it means the interactions between them, and it means the environments in which they live. So it's all the species, plus their homes, plus their relationships. And you may have heard of the term the web of life. Well, really, this is what biodiversity is. This is what our ecosystem services are. This is what our ecosystem services, the web of life, the incredibly intricate and complex interaction between organisms. These three photographs at the bottom are moths in my garden. We're losing biodiversity at an incredibly fast rate. And the reasons, three main reasons, there are others, but the three main reasons are climate change, habitat fragmentation, and invasive species. And those three things are right up at the top there. They're kind of all interacting together. They're all accelerating the actions of one on the other. And invasive species sort of is regarded as the second most serious cause of biodiversity loss. And in terms of affecting our ecosystem services, I think I've explained that, but just on a more general level, invasive species, they cause erosion. Some of them can change the soil in which they live, rendering it useless for other crops, for other species. They outcompete. They disperse very quickly, and in some cases, they can damage our infrastructure. Now, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the different types of invasive species. So some native plants are invasive, and you'll all be familiar with these. So we have bracken. You'll all be familiar with the bracken encroaching the hillsides. Hedge bindweed, the gardeners will be very familiar with this. The white tubular flowers in the summer, very pretty, but it grows by these sort of intertwining stems that grow up through other plants and over structures, and they can completely smother plants, and very difficult to get rid of. When you try and pull it out, it'll just grow back. Horsetail. Now, one of the early questions for this evening's webinar was about horsetail and what to do about it, and it can be a pest, but horsetail is one of our most ancient species. It's one of our most ancient plants. It was here well before the Ice Age. It was one of the first plants. Originally, all organisms were aquatic, and in that transition from the aquatic to the terrestrial environment, the land environment, horsetail was one of those first species that managed to make that transition. So we should respect it for its antiquity. And it's also something that can be loved by children, because in some species it grows by segments, and you can pull those segments about. You can pull those segments apart. And I think I'm right in thinking that the person who invented Lego was inspired by horsetail for this very reason, the way these interconnecting pieces connect and break apart and then can be put back together again. But if you're still not inspired by horsetail, then the best way to eliminate it is get some really raw manure full of ammonia, horse manure or cow manure, and put a big load on top of it, and soon you'll find it goes. So these are our native plants which are invasive. And then we have some non-native plants which are what are known as naturalised, and so these have been here for a long time, but they're not native. And fuchsia is a well-known example. It arrived in Ireland in the 1950s. It adorns the hedgerows of Kerry, much loved by visitors, but it's not native and it's not much good for biodiversity, but it doesn't really do any harm either. So nobody has made any effort to control it. And then the sycamore and beech. And these two trees were introduced into Ireland in the 1600s. So they've been here for 400 years, but they're still regarded as blow-ins, and they're not native. And sometimes in sort of habitat restoration projects, there's a question as to whether these non-native trees should actually be felled and taken out to allow native ones to come in. but we're currently facing a huge bombardment of invasive alien tree diseases. You may have heard about the oak processionary moth on the news in Dublin today. You may have heard about the fungus, the bacterium Xylella, which is in Europe and threatening to arrive in the UK. And these diseases could wipe out all our native trees, and within a short period of time. So sycamore in particular may be one of the few species that remains resistant to some of the, particularly the fungal diseases. So think twice before you consider felling a mature sycamore. The seedlings can be a nuisance, they can get into utility pipes and so on, so they can be removed, but keep the mature trees if you can. Then there are the non-native plants that become invasive aliens. So these are the ones that we're worried about. And these are the ones that are regarded on a European level to be hugely problematic. And some, but not all, are controlled by legislation. The ones dominant in County Limerick, wherever you live, the dominant invasive alien species may be different, but in County Limerick, County Clare, these are the four main ones. We have Indian balsam, very pretty flower, but it shoots its seeds out, it produces huge volumes of seeds, and it kind of takes over our riverside habitats. Rhododendron ponticum, you may be aware of the eradication program in Killarney National Park, and also the Cairngorms in Scotland. Very difficult plant to eradicate, very difficult to kind of try and maintain any kind of natural habitat around rhododendron, because it produces allelochemicals, and these are chemicals that actually prevent other plants from growing in its vicinity. Then we have Japanese knotweed. You'll all be familiar with Japanese knotweed. I'm not going to cover that this evening. And then we have giant hogweed, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Now, some of these invasive alien species are controlled by legislation. And I'm going to talk here about the legislation in Ireland. In the UK, the legislation is different. But the EU legislation, there's two main forms of European legislation which affect us here. There's the Union Species List, and then there's the European Communities Birds and Natural Habitats Regulations. This is the most important one for you to know about. So here you have a lady living in a terraced house, and she is bombarded by Japanese knotweed on two sides. Now, she can tell her neighbour that he has Japanese knotweed, and please can he remove it? And he may not do anything, and so she can ask him again. He still doesn't know anything, still doesn't do anything about it. But at this stage, it can be seen as that he knows he's got Japanese knotweed, because the woman has told him, and she's given evidence. She's provided evidence to prove that it is Japanese knotweed. And then, if he still refuses to do something, she can take him to court for knowing dispersal, for allowing the Japanese knotweed to escape from one property onto another. Okay. This legislation is being used quite a lot in Ireland now, and it's a good piece of legislation, and being increasingly used, and it puts the onus on all landowners to prevent spread. Just putting on some headphones here. Excuse me just for a minute. Okay, I hope that's better. Okay, now we have those invasive alien species that you're all familiar with, but there are others which you may not even realise are actually controlled by legislation, and it's quite possible that you have them in your garden. And I'm just going to go through two of these, and the first one is Spanish bluebell. Well, we're all familiar with our native bluebell, and the Spanish bluebell is, the native bluebell is native, the Spanish bluebell is an invasive alien. Let's have a little bit look at this and see the difference. Well, you'll be familiar with the native Irish bluebell. It grows in carpets in our woodlands and along verges. It's a very lovely plant. Its flowers are dark blue, and the flowers all occur on one side of the stem. And this means that the stem droops over. So this is the very characteristic feature of the bluebell, is this drooping over at the top of the stem because of the weight of the flowers on the one side of the stem, and it has white pollen. Spanish bluebell, on the other hand, invasive alien, controlled by legislation, it's much more upright, and the flowers are all around the stem, and this is what holds it upright. It stops its drooping. It stops it drooping. It's much bolder. It's a kind of much brighter blue. It's bigger, and that's probably why it's become popular. Its pollen is blue, and it has broader leaves. Now, the Spanish bluebell is controlled by legislation. It's not such a serious problem in Ireland, but it's a very serious problem in Europe. So if you have native bluebell in your garden, please gather up some of those bulbs in the summer and share them with your neighbours, plant them in the hedgerows, and in the woodlands. But if you have Spanish bluebell, please dig them up and rot them in a barrel of water. And when they're well rotted, you can then use that water as a liquid feed. But don't share the Spanish bluebell with your neighbours because you're breaking the law. It's knowing dispersal. We'll just look at one other, and this is the three-cornered leek. Okay? This is another invasive alien controlled by legislation. Now, very pretty. Superficially, you could almost think it's a white bluebell, but you'll easily distinguish it because everything is angular about it and the smell. Okay, so its leaves are V-shaped and bright green. You can just see here this kind of ridge on the leaves. The flowers are nodding, and you have a very pretty green stripe in the center of the white petals. It spreads into large stands, and after flowering, the dead foliage just smothers other plants. And we can see here, you can see here in West Clare, here, this was all Spanish bluebell, and it's just kind of died back. And all this died back vegetation is just smothering what might be growing underneath. Here you can see the very angular stems. So that's three-cornered leek. Okay, now we have a native garlic, our ramsons, our wild garlic, and how to distinguish this from the three-cornered leek. Well, it's quite easy. The flowers of three-cornered leek look for that green stripe in the center of the petals, and look for everything being angular. If you cut the stem in cross section, you'd see that it looks like a kind of triangle. Whereas our ramsons, lovely smell, flowers like stars, broad flat leaves, and the stems have ridges, but they're not angular, and it has a longer flowering period. Now, our ramsons can also become invasive, but not to the same extent as the three-cornered leek. Now, another question, another early question coming in for this webinar was about hogweed, and a query about having hogweed in the back garden and should it be treated with herbicide. Okay. So this is quite important, and just really because of the nature of these two plants, giant hogweed and native hogweed. Now, native hogweed, this one on the left, it's part of Ireland's flora, and a recent study has shown that in one season, over 140 species of insects will 140 species of insects actually came to use the native hogweed for food, for pollen, nectar, or for shelter. That's a huge number. It makes it an incredibly important pollinator plant. So if you have native hogweed, please allow it to grow. Don't kill it. It's a really important part of biodiversity. Our giant hogweed, on the other hand, now this is an invasive alien. It's controlled by several pieces of legislation because it's so serious. And just notice here this big dome of the flower. And this is one of the characteristics which will help you distinguish it from the native hogweed. It has a flower head which looks like an umbrella, whereas the native hogweed, the top of the flower, the shape of the flower is much flatter. Let's have a look at it in a bit more detail. So the giant hogweed, the leaves, they're huge. They're about 1.5 meters wide. They're almost as wide as I am tall. They're deeply incised. They looks as if somebody's been at them with a pair of scissors, really cutting down, really kind of cut down. This is what's called incised, cutting almost down to the vein. The native hogweed leaves, on the other hand, they're much more rounded. They're sort of more lobed. And they're softer and they're smaller. They never get above 1 meter. There's Angelica here, I'll leave that. That's another one that people confuse, but that's not important for now. And we'll just have a look at the stems. Now, this is a really important feature and really kind of help you quickly identify the difference. So the giant hogweed, it looks angry, especially when it's mature. The stems can be kind of 10 centimeters across in diameter, and they have these purple splotches and blotches all over them. And they're hairy, and the hairs, they're stiff bristles, and they curve particularly around the nodes where the leaves emerge from the stem. Native hogweed, on the other hand, now it can have a little bit of purple in it. It's not true that it doesn't have any purple, but it's primarily green, and the hairs are soft. Giant hogweed tends to grow in big clumps. Native hogweed tends to grow singly and more scattered. Angelica, it has no hairs at all, but we'll leave that. And then the the flowers, as I said before, the flowers are kind of umbrella shaped. They're very large. They can be 1 meter wide, and lots of rays. So you can have up to 50 rays on a giant hogweed flower. Native hogweed, you will never have more than 15 rays. You can see how they're much more separated, much smaller. Now, they say the native hogweed flowers in May to June and giant hogweed flowers in July. I mean, this year the climate is all topsy-turvy, and everything's all flowering at the same time. So that may not be a good distinguishing feature. So, but there, so this presentation will be up on YouTube, so you can go back and take another look at these pictures and check. Now, giant hogweed and native hogweed can be difficult to distinguish when they're young. So be observant. If you see something that you think could be hogweed, well, you know, don't let your children go too near it, just in case. But the native hogweed, learn to identify it and learn to love it, because it is loved so much by insects. And our pollinating insects are the bedrock, the foundation of our ecosystem services. Now, so just to recap, we've had native species that become invasive, we've had non-native species that become naturalized, that become sort of part of the furniture. Then we have these invasive alien species, and then we have many garden escapes, which are becoming seriously invasive. In fact, pretty much all invasive species were garden plants originally, and we have much to blame the early Victorian botanists for going out to all these exotic places around the world and bringing back these plants to the botanic gardens of Kew and Europe, where the plants were propagated and then distributed to all the kind of country houses of Europe. More recently, we've more and more species are escaping into the wild. Now, we've talked about Spanish bluebell, we've talked about three-cornered leek. None of these have, apart from Spanish bluebell and three-cornered leek, none of these have legislation. There are no mechanisms to control them, and which means that really, from an individual and collective, we need an individual and collective kind of responsibility to start looking for them and to start controlling them. One I'd like to talk about, I'm not going to talk about all of these, but one of them is Montbretia. It's this one, and you'll all be familiar with it, certainly on the west coast of Ireland. It's pretty. It's found in most community gardens, most flower beds. It's taking over our wetland habitats. It travels for miles up road verges. It disperses by seed, but also by little corms. And these corms are quite small, and the soil can very easily become infested with them. So if you have Montbretia, the best thing to do is to just dig it up, put those corms in a barrel of water, and allow them to rot, just in the same way as you do with Spanish bluebell. Don't keep them, and don't share them with your neighbours, not Montbretier. Cotoneaster, here's the horizontal form of Cotoneaster. There are several shrub forms as well. The birds love the fruit, and then they disperse the seed. And this is becoming very problematic in some of our most sensitive habitats, such as Abbey Hill and the Burren in the west of Ireland. Chinese briars, this is quite a recent one. This is one I've only really started noticing over the last 12 months. It's very popular in flower beds, community flower beds. It's a ground cover plant, very tough, and that's probably why it's sold. It's easy to grow, good ground cover. But I've started to see it infest beech woodlands in County Limerick, and I've seen it completely take over the flower beds. So if you have this, it is difficult to control. Get some advice, and certainly don't go buying it. Now, winter heliotrope is Ireland's nightmare. No legislation to control it. It grows, it spreads by rhizomes. These are these underground storage organs, and Japanese knotweed also grows by rhizomes. And it is very good that if you're ever going out buying garden plants or sharing them with your neighbours, if you have a plant that grows by rhizomes, be very careful, because they can become very invasive. Winter heliotrope is taking over all our road verges. It's spreading by miles a year. And a Scottish study showed that 90% of the biodiversity in Scotland occurs in the hedgerows. And this means those road verges, those kind of grassy verges in front of the hedgerows, which kind of line most of our roads in Ireland, these being taken over by the winter heliotrope, and it's completely eliminating habitats for moths, butterflies, and many, many pollinating insects and invertebrates. So we don't even know properly how to control it yet. But if you do have winter heliotrope, please get in touch and we can advise. The only other one I'm going to talk about is cherry laurel, and just to say, cherry laurel is as bad as rhododendron in terms of its invasiveness and the difficulty with which, the difficulty of eradicating it. So please don't plant cherry laurel hedges. Then we have our garden escapes, which damage heritage. Okay, and there's just two here really that I want to talk about. And so here on the left we have the roots of buddleia breaking apart a heritage wall in Limerick City. This is near to King John's Castle. It's wonderful heritage in Limerick City. And the seeds, buddleia, it's the butterfly bush. And everybody loves the butterfly bush because the butterflies love it. But the seeds, it produces huge amounts of seeds. The seeds kind of slip into these cracks in stone walls. It germinates, it grows by very tenacious roots. And the roots slowly but steadily start to break the wall apart. And eventually the wall will fall down. Red valerian is another one. Red valerian, again, it's a very pretty plant. It's a prolific seed producer. It's probably sold as a plant that's, you know, long flowering period, very hardy, easy to grow. And therein lies the problem, because it's spreading everywhere. And it gets into walls, and like buddleia, the roots penetrate in between the cracks of between the stonework. They start to push it apart. The problem is you can't even pull it out, because if you pull it out, the roots are quite deep, and the roots and you'll destabilize the wall further if you pull it out. So the best way to do it is then with the buddleia is you cut them to the stumps, and then you paint herbicide on the stumps. But our old stone walls are biodiversity hotspots. They're incredible habitats for niche flora and fauna, and nobody wants to be applying herbicide in one of these habitats. So far better, as soon as you see these types of seedlings getting into stone walls, just remove them before you have to treat them with herbicide. So there we are. We've covered native species with native species that become invasive. We've covered native species become naturalized. We covered the invasive alien species, and we've covered the garden escapes, most of which have no control mechanisms in place, which puts the onus on us as individuals and councils and organizations to do anything about them. Controlling invasive species. Well, you know, the whole invasive species world is quite a new area. It's a new science, really. It's only really been around for the last 40 years, and perhaps the sort of the momentum around invasive species really just for the last 15 years. And I can honestly say that our methods of control are kind of like Dickensian. They should have been thrown out really with the Dark Ages, you know, in the Dark Ages. So there are two main methods. We have mechanical removal, where this is, for instance, this is Japanese knotweed. This is on a development site, and so the Japanese knotweed is dug up with all its infested soil, and then it's literally just moved to another area, and it may be kind of bunded and wrapped up in root barrier membrane to stop it spreading, or root barrier may be just laid over the ground where it was before it was dug out. So really it's just transferring the problem from one place to another. It all has to be done within the site because of legislation, but herbicide treatment, chemical control is then necessary. And then in other situations where you don't actually have to move the invasive species quickly, you can just use herbicide control. Here's one of the team kitted out for foliar spraying. Here's another member of the team kitted out for stem injection. Stem injection, this is Japanese knotweed cane, and it's like a kind of cow gun, cow syringe. And you inject a tiny amount of herbicide into the lower part of the plant. But herbicides are kind of sort of almost counterproductive. They can eliminate the invasive species, but they bring with them a whole load of other problems. And the herbicide that we use most with invasive species is glyphosate. Containing herbicides, it's Roundup, and that will probably be banned soon. And then the herbicides available to us, if Roundup gets banned, are 10, 20 times more toxic to the environment than glyphosate. So we need to find alternative methods of effectively controlling the invasive species that are wrecking our ecosystem services. So when my colleague Nicholas Head and I, we were awarded the tender to control giant hogweed from the River Loobagh, which is a 23-kilometre river in County Limerick. We decided that we had to try and find an alternative. And I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about this. So here's our giant hogweed. It's a huge plant. It grows 5 meters tall. Here you can see the purple stems. You can see the purple stems. You can see this umbrella-shaped flower head. Here are the seeds. They're large. They have these very pretty little sort of lines, which are glands. And the seeds are heavy, so they tend to fall near to the mother plant, and that means you get these infestations, which very dense infestations. It disperses down, it disperses along rivers. The seeds float in water, and so many of our riverside habitats are becoming completely infested with this giant hogweed, and it makes access to the river impossible. You can't get through. Now, the main problem with giant hogweed, apart from the damage that it does to the environment, is that it's a serious public health hazard. So all parts of the plant produce a toxic sap, which when it comes into contact with your skin, in the light, there has to be light present, it causes this very nasty burn, and it's a long-term burn, and it can keep kind of returning, it can keep coming back. So this is just a bit of an aside, but just as a sort of to let you know that if in fact you're unlucky enough to get a hogweed burn, wash the affected area with cold water. Don't use soap. Cover it. This is the most important thing. Cover it to protect it from the light, and go and see your doctor. He'll give you a topical preparation, topical cream, which isn't available over the counter in the pharmacists. If it gets in your eyes, rinse with cold water, cover your eyes, and go to A&E straight away. And wash your clothes separately. The sap is quite sticky, and it can very easily transfer from one piece of clothing to another in the washing machine. So here's our giant hogweed project. Here's the River Loobagh, 46 kilometres of riverbank, 23 kilometres of river, 46 kilometres of riverbank. It starts in the beautiful Ballyhara Mountains and then flows down through Kilfinnan and Kilmallock and down to where it joins the River Meg. And then the River Meg is a tributary of the River Shannon. So anything that happens in the River Loobagh is going to end up in the Shannon. So if we have invasive species along the banks of the Loobagh, they're going to end up in the Shannon. So this is why Limerick City and County Council really wanted the project to start in the Loobagh, in the upper reaches, to make sure that the infestation was prevented from travelling downstream. We haven't used herbicide. We've only used manual methods. Now, as in the previous slide, showing you that really we don't have many alternatives to the chemical methods. And so really the only method that was available to us is kind of hard grind, is the manual method, the dig out. The project started in August 2019. A little bit late actually to catch the flowering heads at that time, you know, and then because they really flower in July. But we took out the flowering heads right through the catchment, and we removed over 800 kilos of seed. So that's 800 kilos less going into the soil and forming a residual soil bank for germination the following year. And then in January this year, small team of 3 or 4 people, we started in the upper catchment and systematically walked down, digging out every plant. We've dug out well over 30,000 plants. After 30,000, we kind of lost count, and we've dug out countless numbers of seedlings. Here you have just one of the team cutting out one of the flowering heads, and you can see how tall it is. The project has been remarkably successful, apart from a few dispiriting weeks early in April, where we thought that it was going to overwhelm us. We've managed to, we are confident that we will have no seed setting along the entire corridor this year, and also in the wider catchment, because thanks to the many landowners in the area and the many residents who've told us about giant hogweed elsewhere, we've been able to go out and treat those and make sure that there's no seed setting in the upper catchment. And whereas in this middle catchment area, where it used to take us 9 days with a team of 3 or 4, to walk systematically, walk down both sides of the riverbank, digging the plants out, it now only takes us 1 day. And that kind of just illustrates how few plants left we have to dig out. So, just to finish then, how you can help. Well, like COVID-19, where we've learned to adopt kind of hygiene, wash our hands regularly, keep everything very clean. We really need to adopt hygiene. It's kind of known as biosecurity. That's the kind of the proper term for it in outdoor activities. But we need to adopt hygiene in all our outdoor activities, because there's pieces of root, pieces of rhizome, seeds, spores, fungal spores, bacterial spores, insects can very, very easily get caught on boots, on equipment, on spades, and so on. And just by regularly checking, we can really make a significant difference in preventing spread. So before you go out into the country, check your boots. Before you leave wherever you go to the country, check your boots. If you're working, if you're using strimmers, mowers, spades, or whatever, clean them before you go to a site, and clean them before you leave the site. And if you have a contractor coming in to mow grass areas in your estate or similar, please ask that contractor to guarantee in writing that he cleans his equipment, he cleans his mower or his strimmer before he comes and before he leaves. Winter heliotrope is, in particular, is one of the species that's very, very easily spread on pieces of machinery, on boots, on spades, and as is Japanese knotweed. Okay, so stay clean, stay vigilant, clean all your equipment. And then be careful when purchasing or exchanging plants. Now, I've mentioned seeds a lot. Many of our serious invasive species are prolific seed producers, and they may also produce rhizomes. There are many invasive species, serious invasive species, which grow by rhizomes. Japanese knotweed, giant rhubarb, winter heliotrope, giant butterbur, they all produce rhizomes. These are underground stems, which are kind of powerhouses. Okay, so again, when you're purchasing, exchanging plants, just think twice before you bring anything home which might be rhizome producing or which is a prolific seed producer. We don't want to stop people bringing home their and growing their pollinator-friendly plants which produce seed, but those that produce huge amounts of seed, please watch those. And then finally, help monitor their spread. So Limerick City and County Council have produced a really user-friendly, excellent invasive species app. Okay, it's very easy to download onto your iPhone or your Android phone. Currently it only has 4 species on it, but we will be increasing that. There's giant hogweed, Indian balsam, winter heliotrope, and Japanese knotweed. Very easy to use. It records where you are, it asks you to take a photograph. That gets sent directly to Limerick Council so they can check that you've got the right species. So don't worry if you think you might not have the right species, but please use it. If you live in County Limerick, if you live in the borders of Limerick, in Clare or Tipperary or Cork, or if you're visiting Limerick, please use it. Please let us know. We're really dependent on you to let us know where giant hogweed is, to make sure that we can capture it from the entire Loobagh catchment, because any one plant going to seed, they can produce 25,000 seeds, 60,000 seeds from one plant, and that's an awful lot of plants to dig out. Okay, so thank you very much. I'm going to end there. Just the final slide really to say thank you, and first of all to thank you very much to Sharon Lynch, who from Limerick Council, who's hosting the webinar here tonight. My internet at home is bad. Thank you for the Heritage Council first phase funding, which enabled us to do the survey, for the second phase funding from the Department of Heritage, Culture and the Gaeltacht under the National Biodiversity Action Plan, which allowed us to kind of do this 3-year programme. It's just in its first year. We have a long way to go. This first year programme of eliminating giant hogweed from the River Loobagh. Thank you all to the landowners. If any of you are listening, really very warm and appreciative thanks to you for giving us access and in many times giving us huge amounts of help. We couldn't have done it without you. Thank you to Limerick City and County Council and Ballyharra Development as CLGE as project partners, particularly for your vision and your proactive approach to invasive species. To all local residents for their interest and participation, the Rural Social Scheme who came out and have helped us dig, and then finally to the dig out team, to Nicholas Head and his team who have done this sterling job of digging out all these plants, often under quite difficult conditions. So thank you very much, and just leave this up just for a minute. And these are just 2 resources: the National Biodiversity Data Centre, a tremendous resource for invasive species, and then if you want to find out what invasive species grow near you, the maps.biodiversityisland.ie is a very good resource. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Fran, that was excellent, very informative. We've had lots of very positive comments. People have really enjoyed your presentation and seem to have learned a lot from it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We've quite a few questions. I might hand you over there to Sinead to start.
A variety of dwarf buddleia in their garden, and they're just wondering, is that okay?
Oh, how can I answer? It's probably their favourite. I think the thing to do is just to remember that buddleia is a prolific seed producer. Now, you know, there's like kind of hundreds of thousands of seeds will disperse from one buddleia plant. So, you know, perhaps you can keep your dwarf buddleia, but perhaps you can just, I don't know, just sort of pay attention to where those seeds go, or cut one or two of them. I suppose allow it to, this would be the best thing, allow it to flower. But as soon as the flower starts to set seed, then cut it off. That would be the ideal thing. It starts looking messy when it sets seed anyway. So cut it off, and then put those flower heads into a barrel of water and rot them. Take a few weeks, and then you can use them as liquid feed. That's the best thing to do.
Interesting one here, Fran. Oshin and his son are really interested in invasives, and they are trying to control Japanese knotweed in a field without chemicals. They wonder if they're wasting their time. They're pulling and burning stems and some roots.
Okay, so well, I would really strongly suggest that they get in touch with me, and I can talk to them in detail about it. Japanese knotweed is complex. Now, you can eliminate it without the use of herbicide. But it does require really understanding how those rhizomes grow, where they're going to be, and you need to take some very specific steps in order to do it well. The problem is, if you try and eliminate it and you do it badly, you're going to make the problem a whole load worse. Okay, now, just very simply, so Japanese knotweed, it's what you see above ground is really not the problem. It's what you see below, what's below ground. So when you have a Japanese knotweed plant, if here's your Japanese knotweed plant, then the rhizomes can extend 3, 4, 5, up to 7 meters horizontally away from the plant in the soil, and they can extend down to 3 meters. Now, I used to really poo-poo that about going down 3 meters. I thought no root can go down at that depth, but I've actually seen it. I've seen it in a piece of work I did up in Athlone. I've seen those rhizomes down at 2.8 meters. So when you're digging out when you dig out the Japanese knotweed, you're going to need to dig out a lot of the soil around it is also infested. Now, what you can do is you can make a sieve and just get some double layers of wire with a timber surround, and you dig out all your soil, you put it onto a big sheet, and then you systematically sieve all that soil and take out every single piece of rhizome. Now, a rhizome, they say that a piece of rhizome 1 centimeter long can regenerate into a new plant. That's probably not true, but a rhizome 2 or 3 centimeters long with a node on it can definitely regenerate. So you really have to be careful about those rhizomes. Now, the shoots, if you pull the shoots, you're just going to stimulate the plant to make it, and it'll just going to grow faster. So I suggest, I'm sure my email address can be made available, and please get in touch, and I'd be very glad to. I've been working with Japanese knotweed, fed up of it by this stage, but I've been working with Japanese knotweed for the last 12 years, so I can give you some tips and advice as to how best to do it.
Somebody has just raised something to the chat here that's quite interesting. Why don't we enforce strict controls when importing plants like they do in Australia and New Zealand? My understanding is that is to do with free trade rules, and that we're prohibited by trade agreements from preventing those plants from coming in, which is...
And if I could just add there, and this is where what Fran was saying there becomes so important, the raising awareness levels, because really, if you're not buying the plant that's been imported, and this is particularly true, I think, of aquatic species, where people are, they might have an aquarium or whatever, to be very, very careful. We've all heard about, we're talking mostly about plants this evening, but we've all heard about the terrapins that have, are beginning to grow in certain rivers around the country, and that. So it's those sort of things we need to be quite careful of, to be more educated before we bring things into our own gardens and our own ponds and the like.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and I mean, this is a good opportunity to warn everyone, particularly those people in Dublin, is this recent reporting of the oak processionary moth. Yeah. This is deadly, and the invasive alien tree diseases, that has to be a subject for another webinar. But we are so close to losing all our native trees. You know, really, it's not exaggeration to say that we could have lost up almost our entire native tree population within 15 years unless we do something about it. You'll all know how quickly ash dieback came in in 2012. By 2020, 8 years later, we've lost nearly all our ash trees. And this is true of all these invasive alien diseases. They're fungal, most of them are fungal. The oak sessionary moth is an insect, but a lot of the most serious, and actually some of the most serious fungal diseases of trees are very closely related to the fungus that caused potato blight. So no need to tell you about potato blight. Yeah, so it just illustrates how serious it is. Yeah, so one of the best things we can do is, you know, one of the best things that we can do, one of the best ways we can help is to learn to be observant. You know, if you just look around you, look closely. If you see something which looks unusual, if you see a plant that looks as if it's, you know, it's a bit out of place, if it's a bit brighter green than native plants, if it's actually seems to be spreading, if you're seeing kind of trees looking sick, if you're seeing insect masses, you know, don't just walk past it and not have the confidence to say something. You know, let somebody know, look it up on the web, get in contact, and see if you can, and just, you know, that in the UK, there's a good scheme where lots of interested local naturalists are becoming tree disease experts. And, you know, so they're just calling up, they see these first signs of tree diseases and then notifying the authorities straight away. We really need this in Ireland as well. And the whole thing about customs control, Anne is right. We don't have much control, but we absolutely need it. It's really urgent. Yeah, thank you. Good question.
And just another comment from one of Gemma. Gemma has Japanese knotweed growing along by her shed. It's spread from premises sporting club next door, which is behind the shed. Will it damage the shed, and is it likely to come into the garden?
There's a risk. Yeah, there's a risk. I need to see a picture to be able to tell you what the risk is, and she's very welcome to send in a picture, and I can advise her further. But if it's coming in from next door, and if you can, you know, if you know that it's definitely coming in from next door, then the best thing to do is to go to the landowners and say to them, look, you know, your Japanese knotweed is spreading onto my land. You're breaking the law. Please do something about it. And in most cases, they will.
Fran, we have a question from Fran Igo, or I suppose she's letting us know about a project in Clonmel in Tipperary. They've been digging out the giant hogweed for a number of years. They seem to be down to 2,000 plants this year. Now they've only young plants coming through, but she's raised a very important point that you might comment on. Care must be taken with volunteers, with risk assessments. This has to, you know, you have to be very, very careful with people, and it should only be carried out by people who are trained appropriately and no kids allowed.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I've shown you the photographs of what it is to have a burn. Now, the team, we've developed the technique which really ensures operative safety. You know, we do wear kind of PPE and safety equipment, of course. But you know, depending on your technique, you can really keep yourself safe. But absolutely, the people that are digging out giant hogweed, especially if it's part of an organised thing, they need to be well trained, they need to be well supervised, and certainly not children. Yeah.
We have another question here. Do we have invasive algae that we need to be concerned about, or pondweeds that may come in on boats into lakes and canals?
Yes. Yeah, at least 50% of the species listed in the Part 1 of the 3rd schedule of the Birds and Natural Habitats Regulations. This is the legislation about knowing dispersal. They are waterweeds and pondweeds, and they've often been brought in by people, you know, buying a pondweed for their garden pond. I haven't even mentioned them tonight. It's a whole different area, extremely difficult difficult to eradicate once they get established. Some of these very invasive ones are still being sold by garden centres. So if you are buying weeds for your pond, please just check very, very carefully that you're not going to buy one that's going to take over afterwards. We have lots. They are very serious. They're blocking up our lakes and waterways at a fast rate. And we also have a lot of we have the zebra mussel, for instance. We have the crayfish plague. These are all invasive species in water bodies. But again, that's a subject for another talk. I'm not, my knowledge around aquatic invasives is quite limited. Professor Joe Caffrey is the expert on the aquatic invasives, or Dan Minchin down in Killaloe. Very, very good.
Just another question from Peter. Why does Japanese knotweed not grow from seed yet in the natural environment?
Well, because we're incredibly lucky that we don't have male and female plants in Ireland yet. So it doesn't produce seed. So yeah, thank goodness, because many other invasives, they produce seed and rhizomes, and that makes the problem of their dispersal doubly difficult.
I think that's all the questions. So thank you very much, Fran. Thanks, Sinead, and thanks to everybody who listened in tonight. And we'll hopefully see you in a few weeks for our next webinar.
Thank you very much. Thanks everybody for listening.